central figure in the history of Western philosophy. Tomorrow we will look at Schelling, who is a philosopher of the German idealist period. And then Thursday we will look at Hegel's aesthetics. And then on the last day, on Friday, we will look at the aesthetics of Theodor Adorno. So Adorno is obviously, he's not a German idealist, he's a 20th century philosopher, but Adorno's way of thinking is always in dialogue with Kant and Hegel. So whenever he's thinking about a philosophical question, and especially when he's thinking about art, he's always engaging with Kant and especially engaging with Hegel. So Adorno is in a very interesting position because he's critical of that idealist tradition in aesthetics, but he's also deeply dependent on that tradition, and he's deeply engaged with that tradition. So Adorno is a very good person to look at on the last day, because he's giving you a critical perspective on the tradition, as well as continuing the tradition. So I hope that's clear. So as we'll see today, Kant sort of establishes some of the foundations for this tradition, but he's also in many ways quite different from the philosophers who come after him. Kant is coming out of the 18th century tradition in aesthetics, but he's also hi Vivian.
Hi Professor, I'm sorry I'm late because
are you joining?
Sorry?
Are you joining the class?
No, I'm here just to give two recados, okay. Two messages to the students. Okay, and so I will speak in Portuguese with them, that it's easier for me. Então, gente, and I know that Professor Peter can understand Portuguese, so you are very, very good. Yeah. So, não. Então, gente, eu queria agradecer, assim, publicamente, né? Primeiramente ao professor Peter por ter aceito o nosso convite. E, normalmente, quando o professor dá aula e os cursos são presenciais, é um dos cursos mais procurados pelos alunos. Então, vocês estão com um excelente professor. A aula vai ser maravilhosa, eu tenho certeza, vocês vão adorar. Então, explorem o professor aí, façam perguntas que vocês estão com uma pessoa expert aí. Aí, eu também preciso dar um recadinho para vocês, que não sei se vocês ficaram sabendo, eu acho que não, né? Mas esse Summer School, todos os professores que estão participando, eles estão dando aula voluntariamente. Então, eles não estão recebendo por isso. Então, agradeço a generosidade, professor, obrigada por dividir o seu conhecimento com a gente, assim, de uma forma gratuita e aceitando todos os alunos, né? E foram várias inscrições. Então, obrigada. E ao longo do curso, gente, eu vou entrando e saindo da sala, porque a gente está assessorando todos os professores, eu vou colocar um link no chat da lista de presença. Então, por favor, assinem, porque somente os alunos que tiverem 70% de frequência, né, que assinaram a lista, que vão ter direito ao certificado. Então, fiquem atentos ao chat, que eu vou colocar lá, porque as aulas começaram ontem, né, de outros cursos, né, e os alunos não assinaram a lista, gente, então vocês me deixam louca depois, porque aí vocês ficam mandando e-mail, falei, eu esqueci de assinar a lista, então, assim, é complicado pra gente, porque a gente não sabe se de fato vocês estavam na aula, várias questões, né, então, assim, por favor, assinem a lista, não esqueçam, para que a gente tenha esse controle depois, tá bom? And Professor, thank you so much again, and for accept our invitation, and it's a pleasure to have you here, that you are here with us. Thank you so much, and I enjoy the classes. I'll be here sometimes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I will put up the PowerPoints, and I want to make some initial points about the tradition that we will look at today, and then we will look in more detail at Kant's theory of art. So I hope this will work. So I didn't. So can you see the PowerPoints?
Not yet.
Not yet.
No, not yet.
No. No. Okay. Something's gone wrong.
Now we can.
You can. Okay, so now I have to. Can you see the PowerPoints?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Okay. Can you read the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, maybe I'll fill the whole screen with it. Then I can't see any of you, and I can't see myself. But can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Are you able to see me as well, or only the PowerPoint?
Yes, we
Both
can
you
hear and see
and
you.
the PowerPoint.
Okay, good. Because I can't. Okay. I think maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller so that I can see myself. Yeah, that's better. Yeah. Okay. Is that big enough for you? Can you read?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So this is where I want to start. So the course is called The Truth of Art, and that's already a very important point, because many philosophers would argue with the idea that the central concept in aesthetics is truth. For example, they might say that the central concept in aesthetics is some kind of pleasure. And as we'll see, that's very important for Immanuel Kant. They might say that the central concept is beauty, for example. But it's only within a particular tradition of thinking about art that philosophers claim that the central concept is truth. So that's the first important point. So we can then ask, well, why might we want to talk about the truth of art? So one thing we could say is that art seems to be very important to many people, and it seems to be more than simply a question of pleasure or entertainment. And if we want to express our sense of how important art is, then one way to do that is to say, well, art gives us access to truth, some kind of truth. But then, of course, as is always the case in philosophy, we immediately confront a question. Well, what do we mean by truth when we're talking about art? And different traditions in aesthetics, different traditions of thought about art express that concept of truth in different ways. So these are just two examples which are different from the German idealists. So in Marxist aesthetics, for example, the truths expressed in a work of art might be truths about society. So one of the most famous representatives of this tradition is Georg Lukács, the Hungarian philosopher of the 20th century, who was a Marxist. So Lukács says in one of his essays called Art and Objective Truth that that great works of art depict their times correctly and profoundly. So Lukács' idea that is that art portrays or depicts the society and the time in which the artist is living, and that's the kind of truth that we look for in art. A very different example would be psychoanalytic aesthetics. So in psychoanalytic aesthetics, we might say that art reveals the truth about unconscious fantasies, not about society, but about the unconscious. So this is the kind of idea that Sigmund Freud has. So Freud wrote, for example, that the artist is someone who allows his erotic and ambitious wishes full play in the life of fantasy. He finds the way back to reality by making use of special gifts to mold his fantasies into truths of a new kind, which are valued as precious reflections of reality. So that's a statement which Freud made in a little essay from 1911 called Formulations on the Two Principles of Mental Functioning. But we could ask, well, how could a person's fantasies constitute a reflection of reality? And what does Freud mean when he says truths of a new kind? What are these truths, and what makes them special? And why should we take an interest in the fantasies of another human being if that's what art in fact expresses? So in both these traditions, the Marxist and the psychoanalytic tradition, we have an answer to the question of what the truth of art is, but it's an answer which also raises lots of questions. So if we then go on to look at what's distinctive about idealist aesthetics, we can say that in idealist aesthetics, or the post-Kantian aesthetics of Schelling and Hegel, what is at stake, what is at issue is not a truth about society or not a truth about the unconscious, but in fact it's a metaphysical truth. So this is the distinctive feature, the distinctive aspect of the tradition that we will be looking at, that this is in fact a very strong claim that art expresses a metaphysical truth. And we might think that this is in fact too strong. This claim is too strong. Maybe it's implausible, it's extravagant. So this is, I would imagine, one of the questions that we will be discussing over the next few days. What does it mean to say that art expresses metaphysical truth? And what kind of truth is that which is being expressed? One thing we can say is that maybe that idea is not so far from common sense as we might think. So I have a quotation here from a British art critic called Clive Bell. Clive Bell was connected with the Bloomsbury Group. You may have heard of the Bloomsbury Group. This was a group of artists and intellectuals in the British artists and intellectuals in the early 20th century. Virginia Woolf, the famous novelist, was a member of this group. So Clive Bell was an art critic, and in one of his books he says this. He talks about something called significant form, and he says that significant form is form behind which we catch a sense of ultimate reality. Certainly in those moments of exaltation that art can give, it is easy to believe that we have been possessed by an emotion that comes from the world of reality. I think by reality there, he means ultimate reality, or he means metaphysical reality. We can only suppose that when we consider anything as an end in itself, we become aware of that in it which is of greater moment, that means importance, than any qualities it may have acquired from keeping company with human beings. Instead of recognizing its accidental and conditioned importance, we become aware of its essential reality, of the God in everything, of the universal in the particular, of the all-pervading rhythm. So that's quite a kind of ecstatic description of the experience of art. And in fact, some of the things which Clive Bell says in that quotation are reminders of things that Schelling says, or that Hegel says about art. So some of you may find this is too strong. Some of you may find that it's exaggerated. But at this point, I'm just trying to suggest that sometimes we do have these very powerful feelings about what art is revealing to us. And the German idealists will develop this kind of conception of art. Okay, so I now want to go on to discuss the contribution of Immanuel Kant. As I said a few minutes ago, Kant himself doesn't belong to this idealist tradition as such, but he sets the framework. He establishes the basis for the idealist tradition in some respects. But we have to look back at the 18th century in order to see the problems which Kant himself is dealing with. So I want first to look at Kant's conception of aesthetic judgment. So Kant develops his views on art in a book which he published in 1790 called The Critique of Judgment. So he's fundamentally concerned with what is happening when we say that something is beautiful. And what kind of claim we are making when we say that something is beautiful. And as we'll see later today, he's just as much concerned with natural beauty as with the beauty of art. So this question that Kant is raising comes out of the discussion in the 18th century. And it was debated as the question of taste. What does it mean to make a correct judgment of taste? In other words, to make a correct judgment of something as being beautiful. This question was raised by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in a famous essay called "Of the Standard of Taste." Kant was very influenced by Hume, even though he disagreed with some of the assumptions of Hume's philosophy. So in this essay from 1757, David Hume raises a fundamental question which I think everyone who thinks about art has to confront at some point or another. This is 18th century English, so it might be a little bit difficult, but Hume talks about what he calls a paradox of taste. So he says, no sentiment represents what is really in the object. It only marks a certain conformity or relation between the object and the organs or faculties of the mind. And if that conformity did not really exist, the sentiment could never possibly have being. Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them. Each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity where another is sensible of, in other words, is feeling beauty. And every individual ought to acquiesce in his own sentiment without pretending to regulate those of others. So that's rather old-fashioned English, but what he's really saying is that beauty is a feeling or a sentiment that we have in our mind when we encounter a certain object. It's not really the object. When we say something is beautiful, we're really talking about how we feel, how the object makes us feel. That's what we are really talking about. We're not ascribing a property to the object. The problem with this is that it makes judgments of taste or judgments about beauty very relative, because what one person feels may not be what another person feels, and it makes the question of beauty seem very relative. And the problem is that we also, when we judge works of art, we often seem very confident that one work of art is superior to another, or that one work of art is greater than another. So this is what he's saying in the second quotation. He says then that the principle of natural equality of tastes is then totally forgot. In other words, the idea that everybody has a right to their own taste, or everybody has a right to their own view of beauty, seems hard to accept, say, when we are comparing, for example, Shakespeare or Homer with a very minor poet, for example. It seems obvious that Shakespeare is greater. It seems obvious that Homer is greater than the very minor poet. And that seems to be an objective fact. So there we have a typical philosophical problem. on the one hand, the judgment of taste seems to be subjective and relative. On the other hand, we seem to be talking about something which is objective when we make these judgments about the quality or the value of different works of art. So this is really the starting point for Kant's thinking. How is he going to explain this paradox or make sense of this paradox? So the first part of Kant's critique of judgment is called the critique of aesthetic judgment. So this is where Kant is talking about what happens when we say that something is beautiful. As I said a moment ago, Kant is just as much interested in the beauty of nature as in the beauty of art. In fact, in some ways, he is more interested in the beauty of nature. But in both cases, he wants to know what is the status of this judgment? What is happening when we say that something is beautiful? So there are some points on which Kant actually agrees with Hume. So he says that no sentiment is a kind of another word for feeling. No sentiment presents what is really in the object. And he also agrees with Hume that none of the rules of composition are fixed by reasonings a priori or can be esteemed abstract conclusions of the understanding. So he's saying two very important things there. One is that that beauty is not an objective property of the object in the way that other things are. For example, you know, this book here is obviously, it's rectangular and it's orange. That's the color. Those are obviously objective properties of the book, which everyone agrees about. Yeah. But Kant is saying that beauty is not like that. When we say that something is beautiful, whatever is happening, we are not simply attributing an objective property to the object. So that's quite a puzzling thing to say already. That's quite a complicated thing for him to say. The second point, which he also takes from Hume, is that you can't make a work of art just by following rules or by following instructions. Yeah. You know, if you're making a cake, if you're baking or cooking a meal, you can follow the recipe, and if you follow the recipe, then you should have a successful cake or a successful dinner or meal. If you're making a table, if you follow the instructions for how to make the table, you should be able to make the table successfully. But there is no equivalent in the case of art. There is no set of instructions. There's no set of rules or reasonings a priori, as he says here, which will produce a work of art. You can't have a recipe or you can't have instructions for how to make a work of art. So that means when we're judging something as beautiful, we can't just use a list. We can't say, well, if it fulfills this criterion and that criterion. If we can't have a list of criteria, or we can't have a list of rules, and then if the object satisfies all the criteria, then it will be beautiful. That doesn't work. So there's something complicated about judgments of beauty also in that sense, that there's no automatic way that we can decide whether something is beautiful or not. So there are no rules for how to make a beautiful object, and the beauty is not an objective quality or feature of the object. So this then raises the question that was also raised by David Hume. So how could the judgment be objective in any way at all? To go back to my previous example, at the time when Shakespeare was writing his plays in England, there were many other dramatists, many other people writing plays, some of them quite famous. One was called Christopher Marlowe, there was another called John Webster, but nobody thinks that these people's plays are as great as Shakespeare's plays. So that just seems to be an objective fact. But it's very hard to explain that if we don't think that beauty is an objective feature of the object. Okay, so in order to try to solve this problem, Kant analyzes what he calls the judgment of taste, which is the judgment that something is beautiful. And he distinguishes 4 aspects of the judgment of taste, 4 important aspects. The first aspect is that the judgment of taste is disinterested. So this is quite a complicated notion itself. So I'll try to explain what he means by this. So when we find something agreeable or nice, enjoyable, we're talking about pleasure. For example, ice cream, the flavor of ice cream. This is an interested pleasure because I want the ice cream, I want to enjoy it. It's something that I desire. So if something is pleasurable, in the sense, in the normal sense, I have a desire for it. You know, something nice to eat, an enjoyable sensation of one kind or another. This arouses a desire in me, and so, from Kant's point of view, this is not a disinterested pleasure. It's not. I have a desire or an interest. There's another kind of pleasure which he calls pleasure in the good. So here he's talking about morality, and he thinks that there's a kind of pleasure that we have in seeing what is morally good being realized or enacted. We approve of that. It gives us pleasure to see people doing the right thing, or we have a pleasure, a kind of pleasure, when we do the right thing. We know that we've done what is morally right. Obviously, it's not a sensory pleasure. It's not a pleasure connected with the body or connected with the senses. But Kant thinks that there is a kind of pleasure that we have in the morally good. And this is also interested. It's also an interested pleasure because we want people to do the right thing, or we want people to do what is morally good. So this is also an interested pleasure. the third kind of pleasure is pleasure in the beautiful. And this is the kind of pleasure that Kant says is disinterested. So when we contemplate something beautiful, it doesn't produce a desire in us, or it doesn't produce any need for action. We just enjoy the contemplation of the beautiful object. So I don't want to do anything except continuing to have the experience of beauty, which is expressed by the judgment. So this is what Kant means by describing the judgment of taste as disinterested. This is an argument that has very important consequences in the history of aesthetics. For example, in the aesthetics of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is a philosopher we won't be looking at in this course. There isn't time to look at his work. He's connected to this tradition, but this idea of disinterested contemplation is very important for him, because he thinks that it releases us from what he calls the will. So Schopenhauer thinks that in our normal lives, we're constantly driven by this urge to achieve pleasure in an interested sense. And for Schopenhauer, the experience of beauty it's like an escape from everyday life. It's an escape from the pleasure, from the constant pressure of the will, which he sees as a kind of torment, something which is constantly tormenting us, constantly pushing us to act. So this idea of disinterested pleasure is very significant in the subsequent history of aesthetics. Okay, so we're now moving on to the second moment of the second aspect of the judgment of taste. So Kant says that the judgment of taste is universal. By universal, he means that that everyone should agree with it. So this goes back to the problem that was raised by David Hume. If the judgment of taste is a matter of feeling or a matter of sentiment, how is it possible for everyone to agree? So Kant says that he thinks that the universality in a way follows from the disinterestedness, because that means if the judgment of taste is disinterested, it's not to do with my personal desires, it's not to do with my personal interests or my personal concerns. It should be something that everyone can share. Everyone should be able to share the judgment that something is beautiful. But at the same time, he agrees with David Hume that the judgment of taste is not objective, but is subjective. So we have, again, we have a kind of paradox. How can the judgment be both subjective and yet at the same time universal? How can it? That's the problem he's dealing with. So if we say this is a rose, this is an objective judgment because everyone can look at the flower and everyone can say, can see that the flower is a rose. If we say this is beautiful, Kant thinks this is a subjective judgment. it looks as though we're saying something about the flower, but we're not, according to Kant, we're not saying something about the flower in the same way as when we say, for example, that, you know, the rose is red. We're saying something about the color of the flower. If we say the rose is beautiful, Kant denies that we are saying something objective about the flower in the same way, and yet it's also universal. So an aesthetic judgment is particular, not general. We can only make it on the basis of our response to a particular object, and yet we claim universality for it. So it's an important point to bear in mind here is that the judgment of taste is only about the object which is in front of you. So, for example, if you say all roses are beautiful, or that's not a judgment of taste. That's a universal judgment about a kind of flower. It's only a judgment of taste if you say this rose is beautiful. In other words, the flower which is in front of you, the flower which you are seeing, then you can make a judgment of taste. But if you make a generalization like all roses are beautiful or all flowers are beautiful, that is not a judgment of taste. So it's both particular, it's both your reflection on a particular experience, and yet at the same time it's claims to be universal. Okay, I think I will pause at that point and ask if any of you have any questions about what I've said so far. No questions? Is everything clear? Hopefully, which I've explained so far. Okay. Someone has a question? Oh, so far so good. Okay, great. Okay. I'll carry on with I'll carry on for about another. I'll finish talking about the judgment of taste, and then we can have a break for half an hour. Okay. So there are 4 moments in the judgment of taste. So we've talked about the fact that the judgment of taste is disinterested. That was the first moment. The second moment is the universality. There is more to say about the universality. The aesthetic judgment, it can only be universal if the pleasure is the same for all human minds. In other words, the pleasure arises from the way in which the human mind functions in general. It's not so the way that Kant puts this is to say it must be related to knowledge in general. It's not related to the way my mind works or the way that your mind works, or it's just the judgments that something is beautiful is related to the way the human mind works. And this is where Kant puts forward a very important aspect of his theory, which is that the judgment of taste or the judgment of beauty is connected with the way in which two faculties of the mind relate to each other when we find something beautiful. So in order to understand this, some of you may know a lot about Kant's philosophy, some of you may not know very much. So I need to say something quickly about what he means by imagination and understanding. So Kant thinks that the human mind has different capacities or different faculties, as he calls them. Capacity would be another word. And these capacities or these faculties cooperate when we experience the world. And one of these is called imagination, and another is called understanding. So what Kant means by the imagination is the way in which we collect impressions, sensory impressions, when we experience an object. So earlier on I showed you this book. So the book has a shape, it has a color, it even has gold on the spine, for example, there. So we look at the object and we gather all those sensory impressions together. That's the function of the imagination. And then we apply a concept. So in this case, it's quite clear that it's a book. So I can apply the concept of book, and that unifies all my sensory experience, which is collected by the imagination. There are other cases where, for example, you might see something in the distance, and you don't really know what it is. It might be a tree, or it might be a ship. It might be the mast of a ship, for example. So you have these sensory impressions which are provided by the imagination and synthesized by the imagination, but you haven't yet applied a concept. So it's only when you apply the concept to the impressions which are provided by the imagination that you know what the thing is. So it's the concept which gives the thing its unity, and you can say that's a house, that's a ship, that's a table, that's a picture, that's a flower, whatever it might be. So that's Kant's basic idea of how our experience works, by uniting a concept with our sensory impressions. So that's a very important move which Kant makes in the history of philosophy, history of epistemology, because Kant is saying there is a a conceptual element in our experience, built into our experience. There's already a conceptual element, even just to see something as something, or to experience something as something, is already to have a conceptual aspect to our experience. So Kant then has a theory about what happens in the case of aesthetic judgment or judgments of beauty. And his idea is that we don't actually arrive at a specific concept. For example, you're looking at a painting. Maybe it's a painting by a modern abstract artist, or you can see that painting in lots of different ways. You can unite the sensory experience or synthesize the sensory experience in many different ways, and there is not one unique way which is the correct way. So that means there isn't one concept which will tell you what the thing is which you are experiencing. So Kant calls this the free play of the cognitive faculties. So this is a very basic idea that he has, the notion of free play. So in the experience of beauty, what we are actually experiencing is our imagination and our understanding. In other words, our ability to use concepts and our ability to synthesize sensory impressions are playing with each other, relating to each other, but they're not producing a final result, or they're not producing an objective result. They're just interacting with each other. And this is what Kant thinks is the fundamental experience of beauty. That in the experience of beauty, we are enjoying the way in which our cognitive faculties are interacting, and that the beautiful object, something which is beautiful, a beautiful object, is very powerful in provoking that kind of play of the cognitive faculties. That's what makes it beautiful. It's very suitable for producing this play of our cognitive faculties. So Kant can then go on to argue that all human beings have imagination and understanding. All human beings experience in the same way. All human beings experience by this cooperation of imagination and understanding. So that means that we can expect everyone to agree about the judgment of taste, because we're not referring to my particular psychology or your particular psychology, my particular feelings or your particular feelings. We're talking about imagination and understanding in general as two human faculties. And therefore, if my faculties are if my faculties respond to the object in this free play, then your faculties should also respond to the object in the same way. So that means that in principle, human beings should all agree in the judgment of taste. Yeah? So this is a very interesting, you might disagree with this. I'm sure many people would disagree with this. They would say that there must be something which is subjective about judgments of beauty, and what one person will find one thing beautiful, another person will find something different beautiful, and we have no basis for believing that there should be agreement amongst all human beings. But Kant wants to make a very strong claim that in principle we should all agree. If something is beautiful, then we should all agree that it's beautiful. Because what is happening is that imagination and the understanding are interacting in this special way. Okay. Does anyone have any questions arising from that? So can we say there's a question here? I need to look at the how do I access the chat? How do I access the chat? Sorry, I've never used this before. Oh, I see. Yeah. Did someone ask a question on the chat? Can we say Kant accept the words? No. So Kant disagree. Yeah. Thank you for the question. So so Kant, how does he disagree with? He doesn't agree with the. He doesn't think that the beautiful is relative, but we can also say that David Hume does not think that the beautiful is relative, but for David Hume it's a problem because he's finding it difficult to explain how judgments of taste can be both about how I feel and yet not be relative. Yeah. So David Hume has his own answer to this question. I didn't have time to talk about his answer, but his answer is that there are certain people who are particularly good, have a special gift for judging what's beautiful. You know, they have trained their minds and they've trained their senses, and they have a refined sense of what is beautiful. And in a way, these people set the standard that we can all look towards. These specially gifted people. That's not satisfactory for Kant at all. That doesn't really answer the question, because you can say, well, how do these critics who have a special ability, how do we know that they are right? Why should we accept that they are the authority? So Kant would not disagree that Hume has solved the problem. So Kant does not think the judgment of the beautiful is relative. He thinks it's universal, but the difficult point is that it's universal and subjective at the same time. Yeah. Yeah. So someone has just said, well, perhaps what is universally beautiful is also socially beautiful. That's an interesting question, because there is a social aspect to Kant's theory, which I will talk about more after the break. I will talk more about that. But it depends what you mean by socially beautiful. If you mean by socially beautiful something which is based on social conventions, that would not be correct, because you can imagine that in one society certain things are found beautiful, and in a different society different things are found beautiful. Different things are beautiful. So if you say socially beautiful, in a way you're just you're returning to the relativity at a new level. It's no longer the relativity of one person or another person, but it could be the relativity of one society versus the relativity of a different society. So I think, you know, for a long time, for example, people in Europe or people in the West did not find African art beautiful. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a change, and people started to realize that this art was beautiful in its own way, if that's the right word. I mean, another question that we have to examine, not today, but later, is whether beauty is the right word for talking about all kinds of art. In other words, is beauty the central concept in aesthetics? Or should it be the central concept in aesthetics? So there are all kinds of complicated questions that we still have to discuss. But for Kant and also for Hegel, I think beauty is the central concept. So thank you for that question. So does he restrict himself to natural beauty, to the difficulty of attributing universality to the work of human art? Again, this is an interesting question. I don't think so. I think that it's not clear to me anyway that natural beauty is more obvious than the beauty of art. Maybe it is. Maybe if you see a beautiful sunset or a beautiful mountain or a beautiful lake, would everybody agree is that more universal? Maybe that's an interesting question, because clearly in the case of art, as we were discussing just now, there are all kinds of cultural preconditions which determine traditions of art, whereas natural beauty is, maybe you could argue it's more universal, but that's not his main reason for regarding it as superior. But we can talk about that later. Oh, the gifted ones. That's David Hume. David Hume is the one who thinks that that there are critics who are specialized in judgments of taste. So we should respect the authority of the critics. Okay. But in a way, you could say that Kant's idea is more democratic. Yeah. Kant has this more democratic idea that everybody should agree in the judgment of taste. Yeah. Okay, I'll just yeah, so the free play of universality and understanding, imagination, is determined by the limits of knowledge. Yeah. Yeah, it's not really determined by the limits of knowledge, because to go back to what I was saying earlier on, Kant doesn't think that in a judgment of beauty or knowing anything. This is, if you like, a rather strange thing for him to say, but and Hegel, as we will see on Thursday, Hegel and Schelling really disagree with Kant's argument that the judgment of beauty is subjective. But for Kant, it's not a question of knowledge. It's how can I put it? It's a question of our capacity for knowledge, if you like. So it's as though, as I was explaining a few minutes ago, for Kant, knowledge arises out of the cooperation of imagination and understanding, or we can say it arises out of the cooperation between our senses or our sensory impressions and our ability to use concepts. Yeah. That's very important. To go back to David Hume, that's important because the empiricist tradition, for those of you who know the history of philosophy, the empiricist tradition did not understand the conceptual element in experience. The empiricist tradition thought that experience was just about sense impressions, whereas for Kant, experience is about the cooperation between concepts and sense impressions. So if I can put it like this, Kant thinks that when we experience the beautiful, our cognitive faculties are getting a workout. Do you know the expression workout? Like when you go to the gym to exercise, yeah? So your cognitive faculties are having a kind of workout, but they're not actually cognizing anything. They're not actually knowing anything. They're just kind of playing. So that's his idea, yeah? So so in that sense, it's not limited by knowledge. He doesn't think it's limited by knowledge. Although, to go back to what we were discussing a moment ago, you might say, well, there are different artistic traditions, different societies have different artistic traditions, and therefore the beauty of art is not immediately accessible in the way, because you need some understanding of the tradition. For example, in order to appreciate, say, Indian music or Japanese music, you might not like it when you first hear it, and you need someone to explain to you how Indian music works, and or how Japanese music works, and then maybe you can start to appreciate it. But so it may, there might be certain sort of social limits on what we experience as beautiful. That's an interesting question. But I think Kant would have to say, well, if it's really beautiful, if someone explained it to you, eventually you would understand. You would see, oh yeah, I understand now why that's beautiful. Or maybe understand is the wrong word. I can see why it's beautiful. Yeah, because he thinks, in principle, everybody should be able to agree. Yeah. Okay, so so I suggest we've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes. So I suggest we have a break for 30 minutes. So let me see. So we start again at, that will be 10 minutes to 4 your time. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So we start again at 10 minutes to 4. Thank you. So for the time today, I will try to complete talking about Kant, and hopefully there will be some time for questions. So so one thing for the time today, which you have probably noticed already, is that oh, sensus communis in question. Somebody just asked a question. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Gustavo, for the question. I'm going to talk some more about the sensus communis and the question of community at the end of the lecture today. So hopefully that I can answer that question later, or we can discuss that question later. So I was just going to say that I began by talking about the distinctive aspect of this tradition being the notion of the truth of art. And it's clear that Kant is not making a claim about the truth of art, or he's not obviously making a claim about the truth of art. So that's an interesting question. How does this German idealist tradition develop out of Kant, but also transform Kant's ideas? So we'll go on to the third moment of the judgment of taste. So so this is Kant's claim that the only foundation of the judgment of taste is the form of purposiveness of an object. So I don't know how this is translated in Portuguese. Actually, the word purposiveness is not, it's not a normal word in English. The German word is Zweckmäßigkeit, which means, it means something like suitability for a purpose, or orientation towards a purpose or an end. That's what it means. So the English translators have had problems with this word Zweckmäßigkeit, how to put it into English. So this is perhaps the most famous claim that Kant makes about the judgment of beauty. Well, the disinterestedness is famous as well. That it's the, so he's saying that a beautiful object has the appearance of a thing with a purpose, which means an end or a function which it fulfills, but there is no specific purpose which it fulfills. So so quite simply what Kant is saying there, well, many things in the world have a purpose. You know, a chair is for sitting on, and a computer is for writing and doing many things. A bed is for sleeping, and so forth. A work of art does not have a purpose in that sense. There is nothing which is, there is no function which it fulfills. And yet it has the form of purposiveness. That's the paradoxical aspect of Kant's claim. It has the appearance or the form of being something which has a purpose, and yet there is no purpose which it fulfills. So one important consequence of this is that a judgment of beauty is not a judgment of perfection. So in the tradition of the philosophy of art, philosophers have sometimes tried to explain beauty in terms of the concept of perfection. Something is, but Kant says that this is not correct, because if we say something is perfect, that suggests there is some purpose which it fulfills. You know, this is a perfect table. You know, it's very good for all the things which a table is used for, or whatever it might be. But since the judgment of taste involves an object which only has the form of purposiveness, or having a purpose, but it doesn't actually have a purpose, judgments of taste are not aesthetic judgments. So an object of aesthetic judgment does have a certain kind of pattern and coherence, as do objects which are made with a specific aim in mind. Oh, somebody is asking a question. I would take the questions at the end, rather than trying to answer questions as I go along. Oh, utilitarianism. Yeah. Well, no. Yeah, most things have a function. Someone just asked, Anna just asked, is this related to utilitarianism? Well, yeah. Utilitarianism judges things in terms of their purpose or their function. Kant is saying that art is not utilitarian. That art does not have a function in the obvious sense. Again, this is an argument that you could argue about. You know, some artists or might argue that art does have a function. For example, Bertolt Brecht might have said that his plays were intended to raise people's political consciousness. Yeah. So his plays, his writing for the theatre was intended to have a function or a purpose. But Kant's argument is that the judgment of beauty, so beauty, strictly speaking, beauty has nothing to do with function or purpose. But paradoxically, works of art have the appearance of having a purpose. Yeah? So, but the work of art is, or the beautiful object more generally, is purposive. In other words, it has a purpose only in the sense that is especially suited to stimulating the interplay of our cognitive faculties. So that's what we were discussing before the break, that the beautiful object stimulates our imagination and our understanding, but it doesn't have a function. So that's the third moment of the judgment of taste. Okay, the fourth moment. This is the final moment of the judgment of taste, or the final aspect. Here, Kant says that the judgment of taste cognizes something, in other words, knows something, as the object of a necessary delight without applying a concept to that thing. So this is, in a way, Kant is here, he's saying in a different way things that he said already. So we don't apply a concept to the work of art in the sense of categorizing it in an objective sense. But he says that we take a necessary delight or pleasure or enjoyment in contemplating the work of art. It's necessary because it doesn't arise from the specific mental or bodily constitution of the individual. So that's what we saw before the break, that it's not my particular psychology or my particular constitution or my way of feeling which is relevant. It's just my cognitive faculties in a very general sense, my imagination and my understanding. And and Kant calls the interaction of the faculties common sense. So this is the question about what he calls common sense. We assume a common sense as the necessary condition of the universal communicability of our knowledge, which is presupposed in every logic and every principle of knowledge that is not one of skepticism. So what he's really saying there is in any concept of knowledge, any theory of knowledge, we assume that if something is knowledge, then everybody can share it. Yeah, if something is true, then everybody can share it, unless you're a total skeptic. So this is not something unusual to think that knowledge is something that is shareable generally amongst human beings. But in the case of aesthetic judgment, the agreement is purely intersubjective. So it's not, as we saw, it's not based on a objectively verifiable conceptualization of the object. For example, if I say London is a big city or Sao Paulo is a big city, anybody can find that out for themselves. If they visit London or Sao Paulo, they can see that it's a big city. That's an objective judgment. But the judgment of beauty is intersubjective. It's shared by everyone without being based on an objective quality or an objective aspect of the object. Okay, so those are the 4 moments of the judgment of taste, and those arguments by Kant have been extremely influential, very influential in the history of aesthetics. Okay, so the question I want to raise now is Kant's aesthetics formalist? Okay, so we just saw that he says that when we judge something to be beautiful, we're judging that it has the form of purposiveness. It has the form or the appearance of having a purpose, but only the form, only the form. That's the important point. So this means he's often regarded as a formalist in his aesthetic theory. So it's easy to understand. So in other words, someone who argues that what makes things beautiful is their form, their beautiful form. So not something about the content. So this would go back to what we were saying about truth. If you say that what's important about art is that it reveals truth, you're saying something about the content. Whereas if you say that what makes something beautiful or a work of art is simply the form, then that would make you a formalist. You're not making any claim about truth there. You're just saying it's the configuration of the object which makes it beautiful. So it's very tempting to say that Kant is a formalist. Yeah. So he denies that art serves any function external to itself. We've just seen that. He says that what characterizes something that's beautiful is the form of purposiveness. That's Zweckmäßigkeit in German. Zweck is the word for a goal or a purpose, and mäßig means something like appropriate or suitable for the goal. But then the story gets much more complicated, because later, after he's talked about the judgment of taste, Kant then goes on to talk about a quite different aspect of works of art. And some commentators have argued that Kant has in fact two theories of beauty in the Critique of Judgment. According to this interpretation, the formula of purposiveness without purpose applies primarily to the beauty of nature. There are various respects in which Kant seems to think that the beauty of nature is preferable to the beauty of works of art. We talked earlier on about the universality of the beauty of nature, whereas there might be cultural barriers or social barriers which prevent people from appreciating the beauty of certain works of art. And Kant also thinks that it's a sign of moral goodness, or there's a connection between moral goodness and the ability to appreciate nature. But in the Critique of Judgment, he then goes on to talk about a feature of works of art which doesn't really apply to nature, and this is what he calls aesthetic ideas. So works of art express aesthetic ideas. So this is a very different aspect from what we've been discussing so far. So what are aesthetic ideas? So idea is a technical term in Kant's philosophy, and an idea is something different from a concept. A concept you can apply to objects in the world. You can apply to things that you encounter in your experience, but in the technical sense, Kant thinks that ideas apply to something which he calls supersensible. That means it's beyond the sensory world, or it's something that we can never directly experience. And in the Critique of Pure Reason, he says there are three principal ideas. Those ideas are the ideas of God, of the world, and the soul. So for obvious reasons, the idea of God is a supersensible idea. You know, God is something transcendent, beyond our experience, and so forth. You might wonder why he describes the world as an idea, but that's because he's thinking of the world as a whole, the world as a totality. And you can never experience that because we're in the world. We're in the middle of the world, as it were. So we can never experience the world as a whole. So that's also an idea. And the third idea is what he calls the soul. And this is because we don't really know what we are as experiencing subjects. As experiencing subjects, we are not really in the world in the way that objects are in the world, in the way that things are in the world. And all these ideas, Kant thinks, are produced by reason when it's trying to find the unconditioned, or what we could call the absolute. In other words, we're trying to find something which we cannot go beyond, something which is final, something which is absolute. And these are the three ideas which are produced by reason. But in the critique of judgment, he refers to other ideas. He talks about rational ideas of invisible beings, the kingdom of the blessed, the kingdom of hell, eternity, creation. So you can see that these are all ideas sort of pushed to their limit as far as they can go. Things which we can never directly experience. That's the important point. Ideas refer to things that we can't directly experience. So an aesthetic idea is a representation which we can experience, but it points towards a rational idea. And it does so by arousing an endless variety of associations. So we encounter an aesthetic idea and it produces lots of different thoughts, it produces lots of different concepts in our minds, which all point towards something. They point towards something which we can never directly express, or which we can never directly experience. Yeah. So he says that the aesthetic idea is a representation of the imagination allied with a given concept, with which, in the free employment of imagination, such a multiplicity of partial representations are bound up that no expression indicating a definite concept can be found for it. Okay, that's quite a complicated sentence, but he's saying that an aesthetic idea sort of makes your imagination and your understanding play, but it makes them play in a different way because you're trying to think about something that you can never actually conceptualize or never actually experience. It can only be suggested to you, or it can only be indicated to you in different ways. I hope I've got this poem here by a famous English poet called William Blake. I've tried to translate it into Portuguese. So this is a very famous little poem. So you can see that this is it's a very mysterious poem. You know, what is William Blake talking about? What is this sick rose that he's talking about? Is he talking about beauty and the way that beauty is always corrupted by something? And what's the invisible worm that flies in the night. I mean, worms don't usually fly. Worms usually crawl on the ground. So what is he trying? When you read the poem, it makes your imagination think about all kinds of different things. Is he talking about the relation between beauty and corruption, or the relation between pleasure and corruption? Is he talking about the danger of love? So this would be an example of how Kant is thinking. He thinks that poetry is the best way of expressing aesthetic ideas, because it stimulates your imagination in many different ways. But you can't come to a final answer about what the poem means. In fact, so this raises a question. This raises a problem for Kant. For example, Kant has a very low estimation of music. I mean, he doesn't. It's almost as though he doesn't think music is really an art form at all, because music can't really express aesthetic ideas in the way that poetry can express aesthetic ideas. So this is a problem for Kant's way of thinking about art, that music is very low down, painting is higher, and then poetry is a higher form of art because of this capacity to express aesthetic ideas. But this is a distinctive capacity of art as opposed to nature. Okay. So what we can then ask, what's the relation between the beauty of art and the beauty of nature? What's the connection between the form of purposiveness, which characterizes natural beauty, and the beauty of aesthetic ideas? So in both cases, there's a free play of the imagination and the understanding. And it's free because it doesn't terminate in a determinate concept of the object. We saw that with the idea of purposiveness without purpose. The beautiful object doesn't have a specific purpose. There is no, beauty is not in fact a feature of the object. And in the same way with the aesthetic ideas, we can't say, this is what the poem means. This is the concept which summarizes the poem. So there does seem to be an idea of the free play of the imagination and the understanding in both cases, although it works in different ways. But as I've already suggested, he prefers the beauty of nature. He says that the beauty of nature is connected with an immediate interest, even though a work of art may be more excellent in purely formal terms. So as we'll see in a couple of days' time, this is a big difference between Kant and Hegel. Hegel puts the beauty of nature very low down, very low. He has almost no interest in the beauty of nature at all. Hegel is really only interested in the beauty of art, whereas Kant is in many ways more interested in the beauty of nature. So what he's saying here is that a work of art might be more excellent in formal terms. In other words, the artist has very carefully painted the picture, chosen the colors and the way that the colors and the forms harmonize with each other to create a beautiful effect. So the work of art has been designed to be beautiful, maybe in the way you're looking at a lake, or you're looking at a mountain or a sunset or whatever it might be. It's not, hasn't been designed and perfected in the way that a work of art has been designed and perfected. So what is this immediate interest that Kant is talking about when he talks about the interest we have in the beauty of nature? Well, this is a question which the whole of the critique of judgment, the whole of the book that we've been discussing, is really talking about. Only the first half of the book is about art, and the second half of the book is about nature, and particularly it's about organisms, or about living beings. And what the problem that Kant is thinking about is how there can be a convergence between our human freedom and human agency and nature, because as we know, nature often seems to go against what we want to do. It often seems to go against what we want to achieve. Nature can present all kinds of obstacles to what human beings want to do, and it has its own processes that we really can't control very well, although we try to control them. And we would like to think that there is a kind of convergence between nature and freedom, between nature and human freedom. And Kant thinks that when we experience natural beauty, we're experiencing a kind of convergence. It's as though nature, how can I put this, is being friendly towards us. Nature is converging with our human purposes and our human interests. So that's why he thinks that the beauty of nature is in some ways more important than the beauty of art, because it says something about the world as in general, and the way human beings are located in the world, and the way human freedom is located in the world, that we can find nature beautiful. But it's important to remember that Kant does not think that this is knowledge. He doesn't think that we can say that it's a truth that nature and human freedom fit together or go together. This is where he differs from the thinkers that we will look at tomorrow and the day after. We have a kind of feeling that there is a compatibility between nature and human freedom when we experience natural beauty, but it's only a feeling, it's only a judgment. or what Kant calls a reflective judgment. So a reflective judgment doesn't give us any knowledge, but it expresses this feeling that we have when we encounter natural beauty. Okay, so somebody asked me a question about Gadamer and the sensus communis and the idea of community, and this is an important aspect of Kant's thinking about art, which, as we'll see, will be important for Theodor Adorno, in fact, for the whole of the Frankfurt School. That the way that I have expressed this idea is to say that there is a utopian dimension of aesthetic experience. Kant himself doesn't use a word like utopian, but we can interpret what he's saying in that way. So, what is a judgment for Kant? A judgment, he says, this is the definition that he gives. A judgment is in general the faculty of thinking the particular as contained under the universal. So that's a normal judgment. You look at something and you say, you know, this is a book, or this is a table, or this is a computer, this is a mountain, whatever it might be. So that's the process of thinking the particular as contained under the universal. The universal is the concept like book, table, mountain, computer, whatever it might be. And then you apply that concept to a particular thing. And that's what Kant calls a determining judgment. You're determining what the thing is by applying a concept to it. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant is particularly interested in another kind of judgment, which he calls reflective judgment, and that's what the judgment of taste is, and that's what aesthetic judgment is. So, in the reflective judgment, you have the particular thing and you're trying to find the universal. So, in other words, you're trying to find a suitable concept, or you're trying to find perhaps a scientific law, or you're trying to find a rule which you can include this thing under. But you're looking for the concept, or you're looking for the rule. You don't have it already. You don't already possess it. And then there's a special kind of judgment, which is the kind that we've been talking about today, which is what he calls reflective aesthetic judgment. So, as we saw earlier today, in the reflective aesthetic judgments, I never actually reach a concept. My imagination and my understanding continue to play while I'm contemplating the object, but I never reach a concept. So it's a kind of reflection which continues without reaching a conclusion. So the important point about this is that there is nothing forcing me to conceptualize the beautiful object in the way that I do. See, the book that I've been showing you, you look at the book and you have to say, well, it has a certain color. It's orange because that's just the color that it has. And you're forced to say, well, it's a book, because that's what it is, and it's orange and it's rectangular. In the case of the judgments of beauty, I'm not being obliged or forced by the object to conceptualize it in a particular way. I'm freely expressing my own experience or my own feeling of the play of my faculties. So when we judge beauty, we are judging autonomously. We're judging for ourselves. There's no rule which is making us agree, and you can't force someone to agree with you. So if you say to someone, I think this painting is very beautiful, you might expect them to agree with you. Maybe they don't agree with you. You might try to persuade them. You might say, well, look at that beautiful color, or look at that form, or look at the way the painter has handled the paint and the but you can't force someone to agree with you. They have to make the judgment for themselves. So we all judge autonomously. In other words, we judge for ourselves whether we find something beautiful. We judge freely or independently. And yet there is an expectation that we will all agree. So this is in fact what Kant has been trying to think about throughout the whole first half of the book. How can this judgment be both autonomous and free and based on my own feeling of the interplay of my faculties, and yet also be shared by everyone? So we can say that when he talks about common sense and aesthetic judgment, there's a kind of utopian conception of the reconciliation of individual freedom and human community or solidarity. You know, that's a kind of extension of what Kant is saying, and what we could describe as a utopian aspect of beauty or judgments of beauty. So the difference would be you can enforce agreement on a human community. For example, you could pass a law. The government could pass a law saying that everybody has to behave in a certain way, that something is illegal, so it's forbidden. So there can be laws passed by governments which enforce a kind of community on everyone by making everyone behave the same. There could also be moral. Well, Kant thinks there's something called the moral law. I'm sure many of you know about his concept of the categorical imperative, which is his notion of the moral law. And again, Kant thinks that the categorical imperative or the moral law is the same for everyone, and it obliges everyone in the same way because it's a law. But in the case of judgments of aesthetic judgment, there isn't any law, there isn't any rule which is forcing everyone to behave in the same way or to think in the same way. and yet we expect that there will be this agreement between everyone. So that's the sense in which we can think of aesthetic judgment as being a kind of utopian reconciliation of individual freedom and solidarity between human beings. Okay, so that's about all that I wanted to say today. So if you have any questions, we can discuss for the next 20 minutes or so. I'm just bringing up the chat. Oh, there's a lot of questions here. Okay. So yeah, so Raquel has asked if Kant denies that truth could take place in the realm of art, why was it important for him to develop an aesthetic theory? It seems that his main concern has to do with the investigation of the human faculties. Yeah. Yeah, that's an important question. So I can stop the presentation now. I can always go back to the presentation if we need to, but so the discussion of the judgment of taste and the discussion of beauty is only the first half of the book, which is called The Critique of Judgment. And as I said a few moments ago, the second half is about nature and how we judge things to be purposive in a different way. So Kant thinks that living beings, organisms, are also purposive. That means that they can't be explained in purely mechanical terms. Kant doesn't think that we can explain living things, living creatures in purely mechanical terms. So his overall concern is with the relation between nature and human freedom. That's really the big question that he's concerned with in the Critique of Judgment. So the beauty of art, well, the beauty of nature is very important for him because he thinks that the beauty of nature is a kind of, it suggests, it doesn't tell us definitely, but it suggests that there is a kind of compatibility between nature and human freedom. That's what he's really interested in. So the beauty of art is clearly different from the beauty of nature, and this is a question I was going to talk about more tomorrow because it's very important for Schelling. But Kant thinks the beauty of art is how is like nature at another level, because he thinks that art, in order to create art, you need what he calls genius. That's because you can't create a work of art by following a rule. There has to be some kind of the artist has some kind of power or some kind of capacity that the artist herself or himself doesn't really understand. So it's as though nature is also working through the artist, because you can't make a work of art by calculating, just by calculating and just by following rules. So this whole question is the big question that Kant is asking is about the relation between nature and human freedom, or nature and human activity. So I agree that it looks, this is Raquel's question, it looks as though he's really interested in human faculties. He's really interested just in how the understanding and the imagination interact with each other. And in a way that's true, because as we'll see tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, he's not making any metaphysical claims. He doesn't want to make any metaphysical claims about the nature of reality, whereas Schelling and Hegel both want to say that art gives us a kind of insight into the nature of reality, into the deep nature of reality. So, but Kant doesn't want to go so far. So that's why it looks as though he's just talking about human faculties, and he's not talking about a kind of objective truth which is revealed by art. Yeah. So so is it possible for art to have a purpose? Is art being made for political purpose still art for him? So I think the answer to that is, well, if someone does make a work of art with a political purpose, what makes it a work of art is not the political purpose. You could make a very bad work of art, or a very poor work of art which has a political purpose, or you could make a very good work of art. For example, some of Bertolt Brecht's plays, that's an obvious example. He wrote them with a political purpose, but some of them, like Mother Courage, so forth, The Good Person of Sichuan, Galileo, these are great plays. But when you judge these as great plays, it's not because they are fulfilling a political purpose. So the political purpose is not relevant to the judgment of beauty, yeah, as far as Kant is concerned. Yeah. Okay, so so Pedro is asking, there's a tradition in art that focuses on the grotesque. Baroque artists have done such things. In some sense, that kind of excites our imagination. Same time, it does connect to a huge variety of themes and concepts. Is that kind of art beautiful in the Kantian sense, or is it close to the feeling of the sublime? Yeah, so Kant does think that you can paint something. For example, you could paint something which is, you might regard as ugly and make it beautiful, but by the way in which you paint it. I haven't talked about Kant's theory of sublime because I wanted to talk about that tomorrow when I talk about nature, or the day after tomorrow when I talk about the beauty of nature, because Kant does not think that a work of art can be sublime. Only nature can be sublime. But notion of the sublime is, for Kant, is a different concept than beauty. Something can be beautiful or it can be sublime, but it cannot be both beautiful and sublime. But I think that the question that you are asking is, well, is beauty really the central concept in aesthetics? Or, for example, maybe it used to be the central concept in aesthetics, but after the experience of 20th century art, for example, beauty is no longer seems the central concept. So that, I think that's an interesting question, whether things which are grotesque, bizarre, repellent, even repulsive, can in some way still be judged as works of art. Yeah, it's complicated because Kant ties the notion of art and the notion of beauty together so closely, whereas I think maybe for us those two concepts are not so closely tied together as they used to be. But he's responding to this 18th century debate about the judgment of taste and about what makes things beautiful. Okay, so the next question is, yeah, the question about whether Kant is a formalist or not, and whether his theory of aesthetic ideas contradicts the formalism. So this is a quite complicated question. I would say that most people concentrate on the theory of the judgment of beauty when they talk about Kant's aesthetics, and that the theory of aesthetic ideas is a kind of afterthought. You know, it's like a second thought which Kant is having, and I think most interpreters would not put it on the same level as the theory of the judgment of beauty. But I think more in some of the more recent discussion of Kant, the theory of aesthetic ideas is becoming more important. And so the really strong version of this thesis is that there are actually two different concepts of beauty. There's the aesthetic ideas, and there's the there's the judgment of beauty. So the judgment of beauty is formalist, I think, because he says it's to do with the form of purposiveness. So when he's talking about the aesthetic ideas, that's when he starts to discuss the idea of genius, the artistic genius. So again, this is a topic, this is a theme which we will come back to. So the genius is someone who is has this gift for inventing powerful aesthetic ideas, like the poem by William Blake, which I put on the screen. It's a very short poem, but it's very full of these very suggestive images, very powerful images. So Kant says that that takes a kind of genius, but then he doesn't seem to be sure whether you would also need to have an ability to form those ideas in a good way. You know, maybe the genius part needs to be controlled, or needs to be given some kind of pleasing shape as well. That if you just have a lot of powerful ideas but don't know how to put them together into a poem or a painting, then you're not going to create a work of art. So I think it's a very complicated relation, but insofar as I think the aesthetic ideas are not. They are, how can I put it, anti-formalist. Yeah, there's an aspect of his theory which is not purely formalist, and I suppose we could say, well, this is Kant. This shows what a great philosopher Kant is, because he realized that there was a limit to a purely formalist account of beauty, that he needed to talk about content as well, and that's what he tries to do when he talks about the aesthetic ideas, even though his theory of content is much less developed than his theory of form. He has aspects of both. I hope that helps to answer it. But the influence of Kant has been mainly because of his theory of aesthetic form, or what he calls the purposiveness without purpose, or the form of purposiveness. That's really what has made him influential. Okay, does anyone have any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, well, we have a few more minutes, so I have one more slide, which is about one more PowerPoint, which is about Kant's theory of the sublime. So we could quickly look at that just before we finish. So so this is the theory of the sublime. So this, in a way, this complicates Kant's theory even more. The book, The Critique of Judgment, it's much less well organized than Kant's other critiques, the Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Practical Reason. It's as though he's having lots of ideas, but he hasn't organized them as clearly as in his other books. So he has as we've seen, he's got the judgment of taste, then he's got the theory of the aesthetic ideas, and then he has a different kind of reflexive aesthetic judgment, which is not about beauty at all, but it's about what he calls the sublime. So this is very briefly what he means by the sublime. So first of all, as I said earlier on, the sublime only relates to nature for Kant, not to art. Only nature can be sublime. So, and we talked about the relation between the imagination and the understanding, which is our faculty of concepts. In the sublime, it's the relation of the imagination and reason. So reason is, as I explained a few minutes ago, is our capacity to have ideas, and ideas are transcendent. Transcendent, they refer to something beyond our experience. And And another striking thing about the sublime is that it's based on a discord, not a harmony, but a discord between the imagination and the understanding. Okay, so this is basically what he thinks. So he thinks there are two kinds of the sublime. There's the mathematical sublime, which is to do with size. When we encounter something which is absolutely immense, enormous, for example, a mountain whose the size exceeds our imaginative power of synthesis. So we can't sort of grasp the size of, you know, Mont Blanc or whatever the mountain might be, of Mount Everest. We can't grasp it. It's too big for our imagination to synthesize. But he thinks that in our reason, with our reason, we can rise above the experience to the thought of the noumenal ground of empirical reality as a whole. So that's a kind of technical concept in Kant, but he's saying because of our reason we can rise above the world of the senses, and we can think about, well, what is the sort of the ground of the whole empirical world? What is the basis of the whole empirical world which we experience? That must be something which we cannot know, but which, and that's why what he means by noumenal, something which is noumenal, which is something which we can think about, but which we can't know and we can't experience. And so we're thinking about the ground of this thing, even though it exceeds our imagination. And in the dynamic sublime is the other kind of sublime, and that's not to do with size, but to do with power, the overwhelming power of nature. So we see the ocean, roaring ocean, and we realize our capacity to follow the law of reason can arise above any empirical constraint. So what that means there is, I was talking earlier about the moral law. So Kant thinks we can always obey the moral law. If we, no matter how difficult it might be, perhaps it could be very dangerous for us to obey the moral law. You know, we might, but nevertheless, we have that capacity to do what morality requires, regardless of what nature, regardless of nature, regardless of our own human nature. So we have this freedom that rises above nature, which is more powerful than anything in nature, if you want to put it like that. So in both cases, there's a kind of double movement in the sublime. We feel very small and very insignificant because of some natural phenomenon, like the size of a mountain or looking at the ocean. But then we realize that in our status as rational beings, beings who can think, who can reflect about themselves, who can reflect about their moral duty, who can reflect about the ultimate basis of reality, we can rise above nature. So there's a kind of double movement of feeling small and insignificant, and then realizing, in fact, that we are superior to nature. So that's what Kant means by the sublime. But just as in the case of beauty, he thinks the sublimity is really in our own mind. The sublimity is really our capacity to rise above nature, and our experience of this sublime object enables us to realize our own capacity to rise above nature. So that's what he understands by the sublime. Okay, I think it's time to finish today. Vivian, did you want to say something? Yeah. Vivian?
Hi, Professor, I'm here.
Yeah, did you want to say anything?
No, I'm just listening. Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I think we have to finish today. So thank you all very much for attending. I know it's difficult listening to someone talking in a foreign language for a long time. But I hope you understood most of what I said anyway. So tomorrow we will talk about Schelling's philosophy of art. So same time tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.